welcome to the Passenger Seat Podcast, a podcast designed to fill your passenger seat with chat about classic cars, all recorded from my 1968 Morris Minor Peggy. I'm Becca, and today we're on our way to some brunch with my mum and my sister, which should be lovely. And I thought I'd use this little drive over to a lovely little local place to kind of talk about something that's I've been thinking about for a little while, and hopefully garner some of you guys' thoughts on it as well. So, not too long ago at the time of recording this, I'd been at a big show, and as with kind of a lot of these big shows, you get celebrities, car celebrities that go up on the stage and they talk a bit about things, and then they go on and do a little bit of an open Q&A towards the end of the session. And the usual questions always come up in these sorts of Q&As. What's the future of classic cars? Are we still safe to be buying classic cars in the hope that there's going to be a future for them? What are we doing to protect the future of classic cars? And the answers that came back were things like, kind of, look at how many people are here today. Can't you see that there's never been a better time for the classic car scene? And what sort of hobby is it that you could do where you're going to get a 15% increase every year on your initial investment? And I felt like these answers were really quite naive and not very well thought out. It's the concept of using money to persuade people that the classic car scene is safe, and that it's a good thing to get involved in, really doesn't sit well with me, and I don't think it's all that persuasive. I've no doubt that money is a reason why some people get involved with classic cars. There is a way, I suppose, for some people to make money with classic cars. However, I'm sure the vast majority of us here have come to the very swift realisation that it is a somewhat costly hobby. It might be sometimes cheap to get involved with to start with, but I'm pretty sure most classic car owners have had at least 1 month or two where their classic car has thrown up an invoice almost every day for parts that it's needed, that they've either had to fit themselves and learn skills that they perhaps didn't have before, or if they haven't got the time or inclination for those skills, have had to pay garage costs and things like that. And I highly doubt that anyone who was persuaded by the money argument would last a very long time in the classic car scene after a month like that. And so it got me thinking, well, what's a better way? If someone comes up to us at a classic car show and says kind of this discussion of money or this discussion of the future of classics, what's a better way of doing it? I know a lot of us get asked that question of how much did you pay for it, how much is it worth now, what would you sell it for? And I actually had a really interesting discussion with a gentleman recently who's got a very interesting and quite unique Morris Minor pickup, and he has started turning around to people and saying, well, what would I do with the money? What would I do if I was sat at home and I didn't have these cars? What stories and adventures and kind of experiences would I have to show for having the money that my car is worth? And I know that we're not all in a glorious position where that money isn't tempting, or we don't want to, or we might be in need to sell our cars sometimes. But it does raise a very important idea that actually it's these adventures, these experiences, and these kind of unique life stories that we build around these classic cars that is actually what would persuade people far better that the classic car world is in safe shape, and that there's people who are going to fight for it, and that it's a worthwhile cause to join. So I started thinking about how we might best be positioned as individual classic car owners to put that story across, to let other people know about our stories and the joy that our classic cars can bring us, and that love rather than money approach to getting more people involved, because it's going to be really important that we have passionate, involved people with the classic car scene as we go forward, because it's not going to be smooth sailing. There's going to be plenty of policies and laws that are going to be brought in the not too distant future, and while we're very beneficial in some aspects that we've got big agencies and individuals who are advocating for us, who have got a voice, there's going to be times where it's going to need to be a mass number of people. You just have to look at the introduction of the regulatory transport reform, and the fact that we needed everybody to sign a petition just to get things rolling about changing the future of that. So I guess one of the most obvious things is to get involved with your car clubs and get involved with committee positions and things like that, because it's often committees and things within these car clubs that are approached to get involved with activism or get involved with speaking to magazines and the press about classic cars. And if you're passionate about it, then that could be a very well placed thing to do. But I understand that not everyone is interested in the politics of car clubs, and it's not for everyone. I think it's an important thing to think about, because quite often these clubs are the only way we're going to see kind of preservation and active concern for car names and brands that have long since gone, and nobody has a living memory of in the not too distant future. So having these clubs reigniting these names and having committees that are concerned and working hard on that is going to be a hugely important thing. But it's not for everyone. So then there's a thought of, okay, so what can we do as individuals? I think we need to be pretty well concerned with getting as many people interested in our vehicles as possible. And that's kind of a vague idea. So I sat and I thought, what solid ideas do we have? Well, there's been an increase, I think, in people thinking quite well about where they host their classic car events. If you host it in a little secluded field that only the people who have got classic cars are going to know about, then you're not going to get people coming by, taking an interest, having conversations with you that might change their perspective on classic cars, and it might change their interest into classic cars. So making sure that, like, you perhaps, if you're in a position to host classic car events, where are you hosting them, and is it going to get the most footfall from people that didn't know this event was on but are now going to see cars in a place where they hadn't previously, and start talking to owners who are going to be your best advocates for why classic car ownership is great. If you're not in the position to organise classic car events, perhaps it's worth thinking about which car events you go to. We all love a big showy event that's kind of in a interesting place and perhaps on a more national scale. We love our national events with our car clubs and things like that, but also having a couple of weekends a year where you perhaps go to your little local show, and you're going to be able to interact with local people who might have perhaps seen your car driving around. I know that's been really special for me. when I've gone to little local events and there's been people who've pointed out Peggy because of her slightly unusual wheels and things. She's kind of quite distinctive, and said, oh, I saw that on the way to school, or I saw that on the way to here. And so they've seen the car pretty regularly out and about, and now they can see it in a static place. I can invite them to sit in the car. I can invite them to have a look around the car, show an interest in it, and get to know this car that they've seen pretty regularly, and perhaps break down that barrier of it being an unusual thing that isn't achievable for them as well. I think that idea of getting people to sit in your classic cars is also a brilliant one. I grew up with my dad opening the car door to his classic cars to any kids that were showing kind of quite a big interest in the car, and letting them sit in there, toot the horn, pointing out kind of some of the switches and things in the car to really garner that interest in them. And it's something that I've really tried to do myself when I've been at shows, because I think it might not work for every kid. They might go away and not remember it, but it might work for, like, I don't know, 1 in 10, 1 in 20, and that's kind of one extra person who might be a little bit more interested in what happens to our classic cars going forward. And I know it can be a really difficult thing to do, because not everyone is going to respect your car in the way that you want, but if you do it in quite a controlled way, and you perhaps have got kind of friends who are going to be sat with your car even if you've gone for a wander round, then it can be done in quite a controlled way that is going to be beneficial to the future of classic cars, but isn't going to damage your pride and joy. But in reality, it might be your pride and joy now, but if you've not helped interest people in future into your car, who's going to be there to look after it when you're not around? That's the thing. So it might be a calculated risk of letting some people get involved with your car. If you're a keen classic car show kind of wanderer and you're not going to be sat with your car and nobody's going to be there, then perhaps consider putting a little write-up in your window. I love going around shows and reading the stories that these cars have to tell, the adventures that people have been on, and if you're not going to be stood there to tell it yourself, then perhaps consider putting a little bit of a write-up in the window to let people know that it's not necessarily just a shiny piece of metal, and there's a reason why there's perhaps a bump in the back wing, or there's a scrape along one side, so it might not be the shiniest example there at the show, but it might be one of the most well-travelled or anything like that, and I think that's a really interesting thing for some people to go along. And I've seen it happen when I've been stood from a distance of other cars that have got these sorts of write-ups in, that the parents will stand there and read them, and quite often kind of tell the kids, oh, this car's been to so-and-so, do you remember when we went on holiday there? Or this person's had this car as a daily user for 30 years. I had the pleasure of meeting someone who had been dailying their car for 35 years, and every kind of mark on it was a sign of the adventures it had been on and the use it had had. And I think that's a great way of starting to put across to a bit wider of an audience that it's the love and spirit of adventure a lot of this classic car use has in getting us involved and getting us to be as passionate as we are about our classic cars. Finally, something perhaps you hadn't considered, because there's a strong idea that there's a strong chance that you've heard a lot of this stuff before, and you're already doing it. But something I kind of thought of and hadn't really considered the impact of until recently is actually volunteering to go and take your car and give talks to youth groups. I'm sure that there's guides, scouts, and all that kind of youth groups that would be really interested in having someone coming and bringing their classic car, or maybe a group of classic cars, along to a meeting on one night of the week, and talking about some of the adventures that the classic car had, and telling them about kind of the realities of ownership. I think it'd be really great for a few of us to think about going and sharing that honesty of classic car ownership with another group of people that perhaps aren't going to hear all about it, and hopefully pique a few people's interest. And you might think, well, what's the interest going to be? Are any of them in reality going to be influenced by this? And I'd have been on the fence with you until recently, but at work I recently delivered a conference session about podcasting and how that could be quite useful for some of the degree deliverers in getting students to reflect on their experiences and their degree program. And obviously I used this podcast as an example because I've been using it now for over a year to reflect on my classic car ownership, the adventures we've been on, and things like that. And I showed an example of some of the stories that other people have been sharing on the podcast and how they've been recorded, and also shared how my oil change story, which I've had a few people talk to me about now, and how it didn't quite go to plan, but actually I've learned for next time, and that I didn't have any experience prior to that, but now I'm gaining it through my classic car ownership. And I have actually had someone from work come up to me and say that once I've finished my PhD, I'm going to be looking for another project. And I think, having spoken to you and heard your stories, I might consider buying a classic car that I can kind of learn to maintain and get better to grips with than my modern car, and hopefully learn some kind of basic mechanics. Which, I mean, if there's an apocalypse, would be great for everyone to know a little bit about. But also, it's just something that she hadn't really considered before, because she had no experience, and now realises that there's enough resources out there that you can learn, and is considering it. And it's all because I'd shared some of my experiences and stories with a group of people, and one person's turned around and said, actually, I quite fancy having a go at that. And so you never know, going into a college or a youth group or something like that, and sharing some of your experiences could be great. And also, it's really nice to share those stories, because it means that somebody else is going to have them to remember as well, and help kind of share that oral history of you and your car. So yeah, it's been a bit of a different podcast today, and I hope that you've kind of taken something away from it. But really, what we need to see is a lot less focus on money when we're talking about that initial consideration of joining the classic car group, and a lot more and about the kind of reasons to stay and why the classic car scene is safe. A lot more focus on these individual stories that are going to be important going forward, and are going to be the reasons why people will also get passionate about saving classic cars. So a lot more focus on love and not money, I think, is what we need to take away from this, and perhaps thinking about a few things that you yourself could get involved in to help look after, pass on the joy that you've experienced with your cars onto other people. And I hope if you're a follower or subscriber to this podcast, you've enjoyed hearing me share my truths and my honesty about classic car ownership over the last year or so, and are looking forward to hearing a lot more of it here on the channel. I'd love to hear your thoughts either in the comments below or via one of the social media channels that are all linked in the drop down box or description, depending on where you're listening to this. But in the meantime, drive safely, happy motoring, and consider sharing those happy memories with other people.